personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, this is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a special guest on the show, all the way from Spain, Pádraig O'Leary, PhD. He is the co-founder and CEO of TrustWorks. So TrustWorks promotes the legal and ethical use of data in the enterprise. Welcome.
Thank you, Debbie. It's a pleasure to be here and speaking with you today.
Yeah, I'm a bit jealous. Spain is one of my favorite places to visit. So Chicago's not bad either, but I love Spain. So thank you. Thank you for doing this session with me. You and I have been connected on LinkedIn for quite some time. You always have really great insights. And so I work with a lot of enterprises. And so I'm very well versed at what happens within enterprises around data. And so I'm very interested in you and your thoughts about that. So I want to talk a little bit about your trajectory. How did you get to where you are as the co-founder and CEO of TrustWorks?
Great. Thank you, Debbie. So first, I'm not a native of Spain. So I'm from Ireland, but I've been living in Valencia for about 7 years now. But yes, it is a lovely place to live. So I think my journey in privacy is probably slightly atypical. My background is in computer science, and I actually followed the academic path, research and teaching for about 12 years. So I was assistant professor for software engineering at the University of Adelaide. And then I held some teaching positions in Ireland, and I was a research fellow at LERO, the Irish Software Research Centre. So definitely, I suppose my perspectives on privacy definitely come from the more system level and the engineering side of privacy.
That's great. I'm a data geek. I tell people, that's why I'm a data diva, not the privacy diva, right? So,
right, yes.
What is it that organizations get wrong about data in the enterprise? What are their challenges that you have to overcome?
Yeah, so I think the challenges around data and privacy, they're probably the still challenges that organizations, have had for the last 5, 10, 20 years. And particularly when it comes to data protection, those core fundamentals around data mapping, tracking how data is processed or personal data is processed within the organizations, different types of assessments that you might have to do as a privacy team. So these challenges are ever present. I think particularly when we think about data mapping, in some ways, I feel that the challenges around data mapping are big or even greater now than they ever were before. I think companies have traditionally treated these areas of data protection or privacy very much as project-based exercises where, they thought about data mapping exercises or building a record of their processing activities or let's say incident response procedures. But I think what we're starting to see is kind of this evolution towards companies being a bit more proactive in how they tackle these challenges, integrating them into, let's say, a privacy program, which will be designed for kind of more long-term sustainability. So definitely, I think the challenges haven't changed, Debbie. Maybe some of the technologies have, but I think for the most part, technology still has a lot of work to do to keep pace with the environment in which businesses are working in terms of cloud and the adoption of AI technologies.
I agree with that. I think, and I love that you said that data protection or data mapping and things like that tend to have been project-based. I would most think of it as event based. So it's like something happened, and then companies said, okay, we got to scramble and try to figure out where this data is because they need to do something with it. And so, because of the rise of regulation, because these regulations are requiring more transparency with companies with how they deal with data, they have to try to find a way to build this type of data hygiene into their business practice, right? So it's not just like, okay, well, something bad happened, so now we need to map data. It's like, well, you need to always know where your data is anyway. And also, I think probably one of the most difficult things that companies deal with, and I want your opinion on this, in my view, is around data deletion or complying with things like a right to be forgotten because companies have traditionally just gathered data and never had to answer for what was happening with the data at the end of life. So it's like, let's gather all this data, but then let's keep everything and not delete anything. What are your thoughts?
So I think right to be forgotten, I think this is a particularly difficult technical challenge for most organizations. I think there are a variety of reasons for it. I think the first is in so many organizations, the lack of an accurate data map in the first place. So even not being sure of where the starting point is for many organizations is probably the biggest challenge, because if they don't know where the personal data is residing, then how can they even think about strategies around the erasure of that data? We do quite a few right to be forgotten projects, or we help a number of companies with their right to be forgotten capability. I think one of the lessons that we've learned is this kind of like, let's say, trying to build this big switch solution where you initiate a right to be forgotten process, and then this kind of erases data across the different systems. That generally these projects start, but they get clogged down with technical complexity, with personnel changes, with different, I suppose, changing priorities within the different teams that have been involved. What we, I think, what I've seen work best is when companies take a more flexible approach to right to be forgotten project, which means that first you identify data repositories which are affected. So which are the data repositories for this data subject that are going to be affected by this right to be forgotten request? And then working with the different stakeholders within the organization, the data repository owner, then for each individual data repository, defining the strategy that is the best fit for that data repository. And that strategy is going to depend on a myriad of issues around, I suppose, the data architecture, the motivation of the team, the cost benefit, the ROI for building any type of automation in around it. And so often what we find is that organizations are on this almost automation roadmap around right to be forgotten requests, where first what they're running is they're trying to orchestrate a request like this, get an overview of the request and identify where the blockers are. And then they can start to see and isolate individual points within the process where investment in automation or investment in data engineering resources to get the ROI from that investment start to pay off. So yeah, right to be forgotten requests, I suppose, a favorite technical challenge of privacy engineers. But I think the most important thing here is that there's no magic bullet. You need flexibility, and automation and engineering is not necessarily always the right solution. Sometimes the right solution is, let's say, a Jira ticket to the right person, or communicating with a particular stakeholder and then tracking the manual completion of a task around that right to be forgotten request. And then, of course, sometimes it is automation and hardcore engineering from the very start.
Yeah, I agree with that. When I talk with companies, I advise them who are creating these tools, I have to remind them, I'm like, some of these requests can't be done with automation.
Yeah.
Some of the things you're asking for, right? So you have to consider that when people are bringing on tools, say, hey, this isn't going to be like a silver bullet for everything that you need. And it depends on their data system. I want to know your thoughts on the challenges between structured and unstructured data. So, for people who don't understand data, they say, hey, we have this data problem, and they think you're going to come in with a magic wand and plug something in, and all of a sudden their data problems are going to be over. But we all know when you're entering the enterprise and you're doing things like data mapping and you're trying to figure out what their strategy is, you have to have a different strategy for structured and unstructured data. So can you tell me a little bit about those challenges?
Yeah, so I think in terms of right to be forgotten, or even just in terms of anonymizing data, I think within structured data, in some ways it's a neater challenge because sure, you have some considerations around maintaining the data integrity. So when you go in, it's not just a simple case of deleting a particular row, but you have to consider the overall data architecture and the context in which you're deleting that structured data. For unstructured data, yeah, it's a whole other ballgame. I mean, challenge with unstructured data are many. I think it was actually earlier this week, I was reading a really interesting paper and it was around anonymization of unstructured data. And I think the point was that true anonymization of unstructured data could be, the argument was that it was almost impossible because for unstructured data, in order to guarantee that that anonymized data could not be linked to the source data due to the context of the words around it or the data around it, then that unstructured data will become unusable in any use case that you would want to do something with that unstructured data after either or not the personal data had been anonymized or you had somehow managed to go through a right to be forgotten request. So I think for unstructured data, much harder problem. There's no silver bullet and like a risk-based approach. And risk-based approach, sometimes tooling around PII identification can help, but in nearly most cases, you would still need some type of manual intervention before you could say any exercise is anywhere near complete.
Yeah, unstructured data is tough. And then I think people also don't understand deletion either, right? Because let's say on your hard drive, you delete a file. The data isn't really deleted. It basically deletes the pointers to that data so that the system can find it. But smart people can find that data.
Yeah, so that's very true, Debbie. So it's this concept of like physical deletion versus logical deletion. So logical deletion is where you turn a flag and then you, let's say you would hide that record. Where physical deletion is where you go in and you're, insofar as you can imagine that you're actually erasing the data within the physical memory in that location. I think a good instance of this is what you sometimes see. Let's say, I think HubSpot has a good example of it where HubSpot has an erasure endpoint for a customer record or a personal record, a CRM record. And then they have this compliant erasure endpoint. And the difference here is that one is using logical deletion, where it is just hiding the record. And sometimes it's hiding the record, but then in some cases, there might be some logic after 90 days where the record is destroyed. And then the second endpoint is physical deletion, where they're describing that they would then go in and they would immediately physically erase that data, non-recoverable way from their systems.
Talk to me a little bit about the complexity of people's environment, especially when the data is duplicated in multiple places. So let's say someone says, okay, Padraig, go to this repository and you'll find all John Smith's data. But then as you investigate, you find out that John Smith's data is sprinkled in other places. So how do you work with companies on that challenge of being able to track down possibly duplicate information? I don't know what your experience is. I've been doing data mapping for, it's embarrassing to say how long I've been doing it, okay, for a very long time, okay? But what I find is when you talk with companies and you ask them about their data systems, when you actually touch the data and look at it, obviously probably not the way that they think it is. So there's a gap between people's knowledge or the knowledge of the organization about how their data is actually put together and what actually happened. So a lot of times you find a lot of duplicative information. things aren't as neat and clean as you would think it would be. But tell me, how do you work through those challenges with companies?
So generally, Debbie, we wouldn't work on the level of the actual, let's say, on the data infrastructure itself level, or we would very rarely do that. And I think there's a reason for that, which is at that level, I think it needs to be the internal team who would implement or execute on those, let's say, processes, because really they are the people who have, the knowledge of the system, how it's designed, and in order to ensure that the reliable execution of a particular request, then it would really the internal, let's say, the data infrastructure team or data engineering team who would execute the request. What we would generally work on, I think we're like a level higher than that. So we would work on the collaboration layer. So we tend to, when we work with organizations, we're building, let's say, the flow of execution or the process or the operation across the organization. And then we're orchestrating the execution of that request across lots of different data repositories. And for some of those data repositories, if it's an internal data repositories with multiple backups, then that orchestration would be using an API. So we might work with the engineering team on the side of the client to define, let's say, an API that they would design and build to ensure the execution on that data repository. And then we would track the completion of that work in terms of the overall process for, could be a right to be forgotten request.
Why don't you tell me about how TrustWorks differentiates yourselves? We know that the market now, as a result of all these privacy regulations over the years, has gotten a lot more crowded. I think it's a lot more difficult for people to differentiate one product from another. But tell me, what is it about TrustWorks that makes your product unique?
I think this perspective around, let's say that there's a lot more solution providers out there. I think this is just a sign that as a community or as a discipline, that privacy is maturing. I think this journey for the past 5 years, and there's a lot of different needs out there in terms of privacy solutions, a lot of different types of privacy teams, a lot of different types of organizations. And the idea that there could be one privacy program solution that is a one fit for all, it's a fallacy, because the only way that you can provide from multiple use cases or multiple different types of contexts is that you add a lot of configuration in. So within the tool, right? So it can be customized to every possible use case. But the cost of that customization is effort and complexity on behalf of the user. In our case, I think our objective is to bridge the gap between privacy and other teams within the organization. We emphasize collaboration and this collaboration framework that we've baked into the product. And I think because of the users, the community of privacy professionals that has worked with us, we have been very opinionated in how we think a privacy tool should work. And I think that opinionated solution drives certain choices in how we've designed the solution, where we're emphasizing time to value, simplicity, responsible data discovery, and automation when it makes sense and at the right time for the privacy team. Yeah, I think we still have one of the main drivers still. In some ways, I would have always thought that 5 years on from, let's say, GDPR, that one of the main drivers for businesses to adopt a privacy tool would be customer pressure or subject pressure, individual pressure. But in actual fact, and maybe it's slightly disappointing, but I still feel that probably the main driver still for companies to build a privacy program is still driven by pressure from business partners. So this kind of B2B pressure to have a strong data protection program, to be good custodians of the controller's data. And so definitely the space we're in, Debbie.
I agree with that. I tell people a lot, and that this is happening in the US as well, around the adoption of different tools and techniques to be able to protect data. A lot of companies who don't want to do this, the impetus a lot of times is business associate pressure, right? So
Mm.
I see that a lot where, let's say there's a company, they want to sign a contract with this big company supplier, but they need to be able to show a level of maturity in their data handling. So that's a pressure point for them to get a tool. Maybe they've seen a competitor in their space. Maybe they've had a bad experience in some way, and that in some way can be a pressure for people to get a tool. And then selling. So I've seen a barrier for companies, let's say they want to sell their product in a certain jurisdiction and they can't because they can't really show that data maturity. To me, those are like the big pressure points. I've not yet seen someone say, oh my God, like the GDPR came out. Now we need to
Yeah.
buy a tool, you know. So I think a lot of it has been a much like a wait and see type of thing, or like, well, let's not jump in and do this. But I think the complexity of the regulation and the complexity of business process, especially as we see these bigger players being able to push down a lot of requirements for these smaller third party companies, it really is becoming more of an issue. And so to me, that's where I see people want to really get out there, want to be able to adopt these tools. I agree. I want your thoughts about AI adoption. So, because companies now are very excited about AI, even though AI isn't new, but I think just the news reports about it and all the investment that we're seeing in AI, especially around generative AI, there are a lot of companies maybe who aren't even super data mature. They want to ride this excitement wave and they want to find a way that they can implement AI, or they may have existing tools that are implementing AI parts to it. But how does that make your work more complex when you're working with companies?
I see one of the biggest challenges at the moment for organizations is AI creep. And I think over the last few years, how companies are adopting tools has changed. I think the best example of that, or the classic example of that, is Slack, right? Which was this like product led growth where they pushed bottom up adoption, where within an organization rather than top down. I think this bottom up adoption can be very dangerous when we come to the realm of AI, because we can be quite far into our AI journey without ever having considered as an organization the risks associated with this. And then the second element is this: when I talk about like AI creep, it's, let's say, products that have been used in an organization for years, and then suddenly they're releasing this kind of AI powered functionality. We had a recent example of this where we were doing a data mapping exercise with an organization, a scale up, and there was a small number of the systems that were used in HR had AI powered functionality within them. So you would never have considered them AI systems, but they did have AI supported functionality within them. And so, depending on the context of use, so hiring, employee evaluations, suddenly this organization using AI for performance reviews of that. And there was no decision, there was no assessment that we're going to go down this route. It was creep. It was by the nature of the tools that they were using. Privacy professionals and privacy teams, they're going to have to build a second data map. And it's hard enough to build the first one, but the second data map is the AI powered data map. So it's not necessarily an AI system, it's the list of those systems that have AI capability baked into them. And as we know, if you're using cloud, then you know that more and more of the tools that we use every day have this functionality baked into them. So I think that's the challenge. On the other hand, I do think like a lot of the conversation around LLMs and AI is within the privacy community that I think we're very negative and we're very focused on the risk, which is understandable, right? Because the risks are great. But there's also a big opportunity for us as a community as well in how these tools can improve our work, make us more efficient, like they're making other departments within the enterprise more efficient. And so I also think there's a second conversation which should be happening around like the future role of these type of technologies, within our everyday work, right, as privacy professionals.
I've not heard anyone describe what's happening that way in terms of feature creep, and you're absolutely right, 1,000%. What I've seen a lot of companies say, like they're afraid of AI, and they put out these bulletins saying, we don't want anyone to use AI, so you're forbidden from using these AI systems. And they're thinking about people putting data into these public LLM systems and things like that. But they're not thinking about the fact that the tools they already use are being embedded with AI capabilities. So now, let's say, for instance, in the past, you hadn't done quote unquote automated decision making. Now you have tools that allow you to do that. And I think you're right. I think companies will have to have like a second data map because they haven't really anticipated that within their own organization and the tools that they use every day, there's now these new embedded capabilities that are probably creating automated decision making capabilities that maybe they didn't anticipate, that they thought they didn't have before, but now they do.
Yeah. And sometimes these don't come wrapped in this is a HR recruitment tool. Sometimes it can be more a generic tool that is being used in HR, right? They could be used in lots of different departments, but HR are using this tool and this has AI functionality baked in. So I think that's the danger. And so that's this second data map. Maybe you call it, this is your like AI data map within the organization is going to be just as important as your traditional data map that you're building. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I would like to see or expect to see is within this tooling, particularly like enterprise focused tooling, is like a kill switch for these type of capabilities. So I think like companies are very quick to kind of push them into the product because they're great for marketing and they're amazing in demos. We've explored them because we just see the potential value that they can deliver. But I think there needs to be an easy way to turn these off. So like this kill switch functionality, which allows you to not just tell someone that they shouldn't be using it, but baked into these products, there needs to be some way for on a organization account level that they can switch this type of functionality off.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. Instead of it being a thing that makes it hard, it's baked in such a way that makes it hard for people to not use it. Like you say, don't touch the stove because it's hot, something like that. Just turn the stove off, right?
Yeah.
So if it were the world according to you, Padraig, and we did everything that you said, what would be your wish for privacy anywhere in the world, whether that be regulation, technology, or human behavior?
Yeah, I think for privacy professionals, I think we as a community, we have a long way to go, I think, until privacy professional teams have, let's say, the level of training and the diversity and background that they need in order to meet the challenges of privacy. I think privacy as a whole is a unique space because you're bringing together legal, technical, operational skill requirements, but then you also have ethical considerations, which means diversity in background is almost as important as the diversity in skill sets. So I think we're only at the start of the journey in terms of preparing privacy teams to be, let's say, having the breadth of skills and diversity that they need in order to function to meet the needs for most organizations. That's our big challenge going forward. I would still say it's on the personnel level. And yeah, so my wish for privacy would be that, more people into privacy, more people from diverse backgrounds, diverse industries. Yeah, to build that diversity into privacy, I think.
I agree, because when you work in these areas, you can definitely see the gaps and you can see where companies can definitely benefit from having a more well-rounded team of people who understand data and the different angles that data challenges take. So I agree with that completely. Thank you so much for being on the show. I'm really happy with all of the work that you're doing with TrustWorks, and keep commenting on LinkedIn. I love your commentary and the wise words you leave for us. I think it's amazing.
Thank you, Debbie. And maybe just to finish, I'm very happy to announce that we are launching at IAPP Brussels. So if anyone is attending IAPP Brussels, please come and check us out, and we'd love to have a conversation.
Perfect. Exciting. Very exciting times for TrustWorks. So thank you so much for being on the show, and we'll talk soon.
Okay. Thank you very much, Debbie.
You're welcome. Okay, bye-bye.